Hello, my name is Will Rosenblum, librarian trainee at the Belmore Memorial Library. I received my Bachelor of Arts in History from Malloy College in 2018, where I also completed minors in English Literature and Philosophy. I am a member of Phi Alpha Theta, which is the National History Honor Society, and I'm excited to be presenting my first virtual lecture to all of you. In these slides, we're going to be asking the question, and attempting to answer the question, of what is history, as well as asking the equally important question of why we should study it in the first place. And finally, to top it off, we're going to go through a very brief, succinct, concise overview of human history within a global context. So, we often tend to define history as the study of the past. In casual conversation, we'll say history, the study of the past. But what does this actually mean? What does it mean to study the past? So, Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines history as a branch of knowledge that both records and explains past events. I think this definition really hits the nail on the head when we say the study of the past to define history. First, we have to record past events, and then we have to attempt to explain them. It's not enough to just record past events. We have to actively try to make sense of why things happened, and specifically why they happened in the manner that they did. And just some library science here, the Dewey Decimal System classifies the 900s as the section of nonfiction books pertaining to history and geography in a public library. So this begs the question of who studies history. For one thing, we have professional historians who conduct research and publish books and articles with their findings. Many of them teach at colleges and universities while pursuing their research and doing this writing. But an important distinction should be noted between academia and popular history. Academics at universities, museums, and other academic institutions publish original scholarly research utilizing a number of primary sources from specific historical periods such as artifacts, letters, diaries, literature, newspapers, and so on. This scholarly research is typically published by university press houses like the Oxford University Press or the Yale University Press, or in scholarly journals. The work is peer-reviewed and the historians are credentialed, often with doctoral degrees such as a PhD or a DPhil. Popular history books are generally not scholarly in nature, but are written for the general public to enjoy. They are often easier to read as they are written in an engaging and a very entertaining way, and they do not present original research or original findings. And the author's credentials vary across a wide spectrum. And both academic and popular history books are immensely important for our collective understanding and appreciation of history because they each bring something different to the table. But why? Why study history at all? Perhaps you've heard the famous words of the philosopher George Santayana, who said those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The study of history provides us with the knowledge and the wisdom necessary to inform our decision-making processes in the present day. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Every event that takes place on the world stage at this particular moment in time has its roots in the past. By examining our past, we can better understand who we are collectively as members of the human species and plot a better course for the future. History as a field of study can be arranged in a number of ways. On the one hand, we can arrange history chronologically or in the sequential order in which events happened. The three most broad categories used when examining world history chronologically are ancient, medieval, and modern. We can also break down history by region, which is an enormous help when becoming more specific in scope. Examples of this could be European history, Middle Eastern history, Latin American history, African history, Asian history, and so on. Lastly, we can also look at history from a thematic standpoint, say if we want to look at just political history, or cultural and social history, or economic history. But it's not just limited here. We can look at intellectual history, military history, and really, the list goes on and on. But to gain a basic understanding of history, it's good to see just a general overview of what the history of the human species on planet Earth has looked like, which is what we're going to go and do now. Prehistory refers to history before the written record, which is basically everything that was happening before we were able to write anything down. The Earth itself is somewhere around 4.5 billion years old. However, human beings are only around 6 million years old. Just to put that into perspective, if you could condense the evolutionary history of life on Earth into about an hour, humans would only pop up really at the last second. Initially, there were several humanoid species that we know of, but ultimately only our species, Homo sapiens, would be the only human species to survive via natural selection. Homo sapiens originally evolved in Africa, but around 2.58 million years ago, these early humans begin to migrate to the other continents as they begin to use stone tools, which is why the Paleolithic period is often referred to as the Stone Age. But why? Why were these early peoples migrating? Well, these societies were hunter-gatherer in nature, meaning that they followed large herds of bovine animals like bison and mammoths, which they would hunt and kill for food and to make clothing and tools. They gathered, they foraged for wild edible plants to eat, such as root vegetables and berries and mushrooms and other plants. But this model of living would eventually change around 10,000 BCE, BCE meaning before the Common Era, with something known as the Neolithic or Agricultural Revolution, in which many early human beings gradually stopped following these large herds of animals, and they began growing their own crops, domesticating their own animals, and settling in one stagnant location. As a result of this, diet would change tremendously from being varied on a day-to-day basis to being cereal-based, particularly on one crop, whether your society grew wheat or barley or rice or potatoes. That was mostly what you were going to be eating, which ultimately it's not healthy to eat the same thing over and over and over again. It was better to have a more varied diet. In addition to these dietary changes, gender roles would also change as we move from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic period. Paleolithic societies in the hunter-gatherer model were very matriarchal in nature. The concept of a mother nature goddess or spirit was very prevalent, and this would ultimately change to a more patriarchal society in which the notion of God or gods became male, particularly male, violent gods in the sky. And really the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic is one of the world being a place of abundance to a world being a place of scarcity. The picture here is Stonehenge, which is one of the most famous Neolithic structures that we have left, and that is really iconic in southern England. And ultimately, as a result of this Neolithic revolution, we would get the advent of civilization, which would begin in the Fertile Crescent, which we're going to talk about a little more in the next slide. When we say that civilization began in the Fertile Crescent, we are referring to what we know geographically as the Middle East, specifically in the valley between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. A great many civilizations would emerge in what was then Mesopotamia, which would make great contributions of monumental importance to the course of history. The Sumerians, for example, would literally invent the wheel, along with the first system of writing known as cuneiform. The Babylonians would create the first system of law, King Hammurabi's Code, which introduced the rather harsh concept of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. While polytheism, or belief in many gods, would remain the dominant form of religious faith throughout the ancient civilizations of the Middle East, the first major monotheistic religion would emerge around 3,500 years ago, called Judaism. This is excluding Persian Zoroastrianism, which was more dualistic in nature. The Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, is a compilation of several texts, including the Torah, containing the 5 books of Moses, along with the Nevi'im, or the Book of the Prophets, and the Kithuvim, or the writings, such as the Psalms, Proverbs, and others. And the idea most central to the Jewish faith is that God, the one God, who goes by a lot of different names throughout the Hebrew Bible, created a unique covenant with the children of Israel, or the Jewish people. While various civilizations would rise and fall in the ancient world, 3 civilizations centered around the Mediterranean would come to dominate our collective historical consciousness. They are well encapsulated in the photos here. On the left, we have the Rosetta Stone, and on the right, we have a model of the Parthenon, and both of these can be seen in the British Museum in London. So these civilizations were Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Now, the civilization of ancient Egypt would go through several stages of development. The Old Kingdom would last from 2615 to 1991 BCE, and it began with King Menes uniting the civilizations of the Upper and Lower Nile valleys under a single dynasty. The rulers of Egypt would be known as pharaohs, and the Great Pyramids of Giza were built in this Old Kingdom period. The Middle Kingdom would last from 1991 to 1570 BCE, and the New Kingdom would last from 1570 to 332 BCE. Now, this period saw the formation of the Greek city-states who would emerge triumphant in their resistance of the Persian Empire between 499 and 478 BCE. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote the histories of these Persian wars, is often considered to be the father of history. Victory against the Persians at the Battle of Marathon was largely due to the Athenian navy, and the Delian League, in which the other Greek city-states would pay tribute to the democracy of Athens, where Greek philosophy would flourish, would endure until the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and the militaristic Greek city-state Sparta. The historian Thucydides would write the histories of these wars in his History of the Peloponnesian Wars. Weakened by this conflict, the Greek city-states would eventually fall to the Macedonian king Philip II, and when he died, his son Alexander the Great would conquer Egypt, establishing his city of Alexandria and its library, Persia, and even parts of India, though he found elephants quite difficult to fight. Alexander would merge many of the cultural elements of these civilizations into his Hellenistic empire, as is evident by the above sculpture of the Greek god Zeus wearing the ram's horns of the Egyptian god Ammon, which can be seen in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, the Roman Republic on the Italian peninsula would resist Macedonian conquest just as the Greek city-states had once resisted Persian conquest, and after Alexander's untimely death in 323 BCE, his empire became decentralized under his remaining generals. A Roman by the name of Julius Caesar would begin to conquer an empire that would eventually become larger even than Alexander's, and after his assassination by the Roman senators, Octavius, later known as Augustus Caesar, would do what Julius could not and become emperor not only of the conquered territories, but of Rome itself. The Roman Empire at its height would stretch from Egypt and other parts of North Africa all the way up to Britain, and it would continue the process of cultural diffusion that we were discussing in the example of the above sculpture on the right, which is a combination of the Egyptian goddess Isis and the Greek goddess Aphrodite, who was referred to as Venus by the Romans. Now, this sculpture was made in Egypt under Roman occupation, and it can be seen also in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's wing of the same name. Now, the historical record transfers from BCE, or before the Common Era, to the Common Era, during the time of the Roman Empire, in which a Jewish man by the name of Jesus was put to death by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Jerusalem, for claiming to be the Messiah. Followers of his message, which stressed a different interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, would grow gradually in number and become known as Christians, and a New Testament would be written, which together with the Old Testament, based in the Hebrew Bible, would become the Christian Bible. Early Christians faced intense persecution at the hands of the Romans until, during the later period of the empire when the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 312 and made it the official religion of Rome, calling the Council of Nicaea in 325. Beset with internal issues both economic and militaristic, the Roman Empire would recede over time while incurring attacks from Germanic tribes across Europe. Having been administratively split under the Emperor Diocletian, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire would officially occur in 476, when the barbarian Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor Romulus Augustus. The Eastern Roman Empire, with the city of Constantinople at its center, would endure until 1453 as the civilization of Byzantium. The ancient Sanskrit texts, known as the Upanishads, would set the stage for Indian civilization. The Upanishads discuss a doctrine of rebirth or reincarnation known as samsara, which is ultimately controlled by a person's actions or karma. the development of a caste system would emerge, structuring Indian society into a hierarchy around Brahmanism. But sometime between 563 and 483 BCE, a Brahmin of the highest caste by the name of Siddhartha Gautama taught of a way out of suffering and samsara to an enlightened state known as nirvana. Gautama would become known as the Buddha, meaning the enlightened one, and his teachings are recorded in the Dharmapada, one of the central texts of Buddhism. Another faith that broke with Brahmanism was Jainism, which stresses extreme nonviolence, the point to which a Jain cannot even kill an insect. Under the Maurya dynasty, founded by Chandragupta Maurya, the Brahmanistic faith would make a comeback during the reign of Ashoka and was gradually reworked into Hinduism, a polytheistic faith featuring a wide pantheon of gods, with Brahma as the creator. And the Bhagavad Gita is the central Hindu text, and 90% of India is still Hindu in the present day. Several dynastic struggles would occur in India, which resulted in the Gupta dynasty uniting northern India between 320 and 535 BCE. Meanwhile, the Great Wall of China would be erected by the Qin dynasty against the Huns in 214 BCE, and under the Han dynasty, which succeeded the Qin, Buddhism would diffuse into Chinese culture, merging with the Confucian ideals of familial piety. And on the islands of Japan, Buddhism would combine with the animistic faith of the early Japanese peoples, and this new faith would be called Shinto. Eventually, the notion of harmonic convergence between the forces of yin and yang would take root in Japan in the form of a sect called Zen Buddhism, which had been influenced by the Taoist or Taoist tradition in China. The two Buddha statues above can both be seen in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the one on the right being in the Indian tradition, the one on the left in the Chinese. Now, the Olmec civilization would serve as the first in Mesoamerica before the formation of the great Mayan Empire, while North American societies would retain many elements of the hunter-gatherer way of life. And not many sources exist regarding these peoples, unfortunately, as indigenous tribes did not have a system of writing. The first African societies, excluding Egypt, existed in a similar context, but the kingdom of Aksum, centered around northern Ethiopia, would endure between the 1st and 6th centuries, bringing us to the next period of human history, which we will now discuss. Medieval history refers to the approximate 1,000-year gap between the ancient and modern periods. After the last Roman emperor was deposed in 476, the lands of the Western Empire, which were geographically in Europe, would enter the early Middle Ages, often called the Dark Ages. It should be noted that the Dark Ages do not refer to the entirety of the medieval period, but namely the period in Europe between the fall of Rome and around the year 1000. The Germanic tribes that had defeated the Romans existed in largely tribal or clan-based societies, but this would gradually change as monarchies would begin to form. The last Roman institution to endure, the Catholic Church, would go about the long process of converting many of these tribes and kings to Christianity, culminating in the Frankish king Charlemagne's coronation by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire was short-lived, and by the time the Central or High Middle Ages come about, distinct kingdoms had emerged in Europe, such as a great many decentralized German principalities, as well as the Kingdom of France under the Capetian dynasty, and the Kingdom of England, initially formed by the Anglo-Saxons, but conquered by the Normans in 1066, from which the Plantagenet dynasty would emerge over time. But before the early Middle Ages had ended, the third of the three major monotheistic religions had formed in the Middle East on the Arabia Peninsula during the 7th century. This religion is called Islam, in which Allahu Akbar is the central message, meaning that God is great, and its founder Muhammad is his only prophet. The Umayyad Caliphate would be the first Muslim empire, and the Abbasid Caliphate would be the second, having conquered the entire Middle East, Egypt, North Africa, and even the Iberian Peninsula of Europe. A series of religious wars, called the Crusades, would dominate the Central or High Middle Ages between 1096 and 1291, and they would see the powers of Christian Europe, both papal and monarchical, the Muslim world, and the Byzantine world, locked in conflict. While these wars were gruesome, bloody affairs, many of the trade routes of the ancient Mediterranean began to reopen, and much cultural diffusion would occur in this period, while the first European universities were founded. The medieval synthesis, highlighting the tension and attempt at reconciliation between Greco-Roman philosophy and Judeo-Christian theology, would form the basis of Western intellectual history. The later Middle Ages, or the period between 1300 and 1500, would see the roots of the modern world begin to form, which we will discuss in a minute. The above photos are of Westminster Abbey in London, England on the top left, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France on the bottom left, one of Notre Dame's rose windows on the top right, the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, France, directly below, and the University of Oxford's All Souls College on the bottom right. Before we move on, examine the armor of a feudal European knight and a feudal Japanese samurai, both from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Arms and Armor Wing. Japan would remain isolated throughout the Middle Ages, as China, after the Tang and Sung dynasties, would fall to the Mongols and the Yuan dynasty was formed, while India would fall to Muslim conquest and the Delhi Sultanate was formed. Also, the Muslim conquests of Africa would see much of the continent converted to Islam, and the Ghana Empire of the 10th century would break up into several states in the 11th. Modern history is best divided between the early modern period, roughly between 1450 and 1789, covering the end of the Middle Ages in the latter portion of the 15th century, into the 16th, 17th, and most of the 18th centuries, and the late modern period, covering the end of the 18th, the 19th, and 20th centuries between 1789 and 1999. Of course, the 21st century, only in its 20th year, is our contemporary present. Now, Byzantium would fall to the Seljuk Turks, who would later form the Ottoman Empire, in 1453, and many Byzantine scholars took their Greek texts and sailed to the Italian peninsula, where a classical humanist movement known as the Renaissance, or Rebirth, would take root in powerful city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan. The two paintings featured here are both by Leonardo da Vinci and can be seen in the Louvre in Paris. They are the Mona Lisa on the left and the Virgin of the Rocks on the right, and they represent some of the heights of Renaissance artistic technique and ability. 1453 also saw the end of a series of wars known as the Hundred Years' War between the monarchies of France and England, whose populations had also been devastated by the bubonic plague or Black Death. Finally, in 1492, Granada, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, would fall to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and the Inquisition would begin, but not necessarily before Ferdinand and Isabella decided to fund an Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus, who was seeking a trade route to Asia based on entirely faulty navigational calculations. As a result, the Old World and the New World of the Americas would finally become acquainted in a way they had never been before, and the early modern period could begin. Now, sadly, the results of Columbus's voyages would lead to the destruction of indigenous societies throughout the Americas, as European colonialism became the dominant feature of the next 3 centuries. The 16th century would see the occurrence of a Reformation in Europe, in which the united Christendom of the Middle Ages would break into several Christian denominations. While the Italian city-states, France, and Spain would all remain Catholic, many of the German principalities and surrounding areas would adopt various forms of Protestantism, such as Lutheranism, based on the teachings of Martin Luther, and Calvinism, based on the teachings of John Calvin. The formation of the Church of England under the Tudor dynasty, which had come to power following the Wars of the Roses, would oversee a gradual rise in England's position on the European stage, resulting in its resistance of Spanish hegemony or dominance towards the end of the century. After the defeat of its armada, the Spanish Empire, which had colonized most of Central and South America, except Portuguese Brazil, and having destroyed the Mesoamerican civilizations of the Aztec and Inca, would slowly begin to weaken, and the next century would see a definite shift in European power. The above photos are of an Elizabethan courtier's tournament armor, also in the Met's Arms and Armor wing on the left, and on the right is a recreation of Shakespeare's Globe, which is a fully operational theatre and museum on the Thames in London. Now, in the East, the Mughal Empire would be established in India during the 16th century, and the Ottoman Empire would hold all of what was Byzantium, including Greece, Turkey, and much of the Mediterranean coast of the Middle East, while the Safavid dynasty would rule Persia. The Ming dynasty in China would burn Admiral Zheng He's fleet, and all Chinese exploration would cease. The 17th century would see the ascendancy of France under the Bourbon dynasty at the expense of Spain. Louis XIV's chapel in his Palace of Versailles, as can be seen on the left, is a good example of the wealth and splendor of France as the center of absolute monarchy. Impressed by the beauty of Versailles, Peter the Great of Russia would model St. Petersburg on its architectural style. Now on the right we have St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which was rebuilt in a more modern than medieval style by Sir Christopher Wren after the Great Fire of London. Under the Stuart dynasty, the English Civil War would put England into turmoil between 1642 and 1649, and the Commonwealth, under Oliver Cromwell, that succeeded it was disastrous. Following the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 would see the creation of an English Bill of Rights, which would protect the rights of Parliament against the monarchy, thus limiting royal power. Meanwhile, on the European continent, the Catholic and Protestant powers fought the 30 Years' War, resulting in the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 and the creation of the modern state system. The scientific revolution in Europe would make serious breakthroughs to our understanding of the world in spite of the Inquisition that tried to suppress it, and by the end of this century, the Dutch, French, and English had all established colonies in North America, while Spanish colonial presence continued to decline. Now, the English would take all of the Dutch possessions in North America, uniting the eastern seaboard, though the Dutch would establish the colony of Cape Town in 1652 in South Africa. Now, notably, the African slave trade would be exploited as the transatlantic slave trade in this century, and the Qing dynasty would form in China, which would endure through the next 2 centuries as the last of the many Chinese dynasties. All while continental and colonial struggles raged between the various powers of Europe, the 18th century would see an intellectual movement take hold in Europe, known as the Enlightenment, in which classical liberal ideals such as the general will, the social contract, the freedom of expression, and the rights of individuals would be espoused to undermine the legacies of feudal and monarchical government. These ideas would greatly influence the 13 British colonies of North America, resulting in their declaration of independence from Great Britain's empire in 1776. Ultimately, they would win their independence with the help of Louis XVI of France, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed between Britain, France, and the new United States of America. The photo on the top right is of the famous painting of General Washington crossing the Delaware on December 26, 1776, to make a surprise attack and win the Battle of Trenton. While seemingly insignificant at the time, the Constitution of the United States was signed in 1787, outlining a republic for the structure of the American government. Washington was elected president in 1789, and the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to protect the individual rights of American citizens, something the English Bill of Rights had never done. The more significant event of 1789 at the time was the outbreak of the French Revolution, inspired by the American Revolution, which would result in the beheading of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and a reign of terror from 1793 to 1794 would ensue, in which the French revolutionaries executed any and all suspected traitors to the cause, while fighting the major European powers simultaneously. A new government, known as the Directory, was set up from 1795 to 1799, which would eventually result in the General Napoleon Bonaparte becoming Emperor of the French in 1804. The photo on the bottom right is of a painting at Versailles depicting the Battle of Aboukir, in which Napoleon defeated the Ottomans in Egypt, who had been supported by the British. A brilliant commander of armies, Napoleon would conquer most of Europe excluding Great Britain, whose superior navy under Lord Admiral Nelson smashed his fleet to pieces at the Battle of Trafalgar on October 21, 1805. Trafalgar Square in London is named after this battle. Napoleon was defeated in 1814 after a horribly unsuccessful campaign into Russia, where he was exiled to the island of Elba, but he would return to Europe only to be defeated again at Waterloo on June 18, 1815. This time, his defeat was for good, and he'd be held as prisoner on the island of St. Helena until his death in 1821. The European powers of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia would hold the Congress of Vienna, thus establishing a balance of power in Europe that would last through the 19th century. Following the Napoleonic Wars, a complex system of European political relations, known as the Concert of Europe, would keep these powers at relative peace for most of the century. Big Ben and Tower Bridge of London are pictured here, as Great Britain was the clear hegemonic power of the world following the fall of Napoleon, having industrialized to great effect, and throughout the 19th century, its empire would grow exponentially to include not only previous American possessions like Canada, but India, which had been taken from the Mughals initially by the British East India Company in the 18th century, and the British government would officially take over in this century in 1848. As well as Australia, where Aborigines culture, which had been isolated from global affairs, would be devastated, Egypt, and much of East Africa, as well as South Africa, which it had taken from the Dutch twice. The British would fight several wars against the Qing in China, resulting in the carving of spheres of influence into China by the Western powers. What the British always wanted most from China was tea, which they would steal in a clandestine mission and plant in India in regions like Darjeeling, Assam, and Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. During the Meiji period between 1868 and 1914, Japan would abolish feudalism completely and establish a strong central government, quickly becoming an industrial world power, while the Ottoman Empire failed to adapt to the changing pressures of the modern world. The French would hold their colonies in North and West Africa, but political instability would continue to wreak havoc in France throughout the 1800s. The young United States would have its union tested over the issue of slavery in the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, and would embark on a period of industrialization in its aftermath. Now, a number of Latin American countries would declare and fight for their independence over the course of the 19th century, first starting back while Napoleon had Spain under his control. Italy would unify in the 1860s, and Germany would officially unify in 1871, quickly industrializing. By the end of the 19th century, the industrial power of Germany and the United States rivaled even that of Great Britain, and secret alliances would be made among the European powers. Okay, a brief recap of the 20th century is particularly difficult, as it's the century closest to our contemporary minds. The beginning of the century witnessed La Belle Époque, or the Beautiful Age, as all seemed well and good, until 1914, when a Serbian Archduke was assassinated and the First World War, known simply as the Great War at the time, broke out. The war would last until 1918, and during that 4-year period, more people would die than ever before. Ultimately, Britain and France, with American aid in the final year, would emerge victorious over Germany and Austria-Hungary despite nearly an entire generation being wiped out. The Treaty of Versailles would punish Germany with extreme harshness while breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement would see Britain and France carve up the Ottoman Empire, which had been on the losing side, into mandates where the British would prop up monarchies and the French would attempt to create republics in the Middle East. The Russian Revolution of 1917 would see the establishment of the Soviet Union, the world's first communist regime, while the Chinese Revolution of 1911 saw the fall of the Qing dynasty. The interwar period would see the United States totally isolated from global affairs, though the women's suffrage movement would prove successful, gaining American women the right to vote in 1920. Over the course of the 1930s, a global Great Depression would bring the economies of the world to their knees, and fascism began its rise in Europe during this period, where several dictators came to power, including Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, and of course Hitler in Germany. As a result, the Second World War would break out in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland and very quickly forced France into submission by 1940. The British would defend their island with Winston Churchill as their prime minister, in the air and on the sea, and when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States entered the war in support of the Allied cause. The above photos are from the American cemetery in Normandy, where on June 6, 1944, a combined force of British, American, Canadian, and French soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy to invade Europe and free it from Hitler's grasp. They would prove successful on the 8th of May in 1945 when Nazi Germany surrendered after fighting a war on two fronts between the aforementioned powers to the west and the Soviets to the east. The true horrors of the Holocaust were laid bare to the world after Hitler's final solution had resulted in the mass murder of 6 million Jews. And the American forces would continue to fight the Japanese in the Pacific until August, after the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in July had obliterated the cities, killing countless Japanese civilians. The post-war world would see the creation of a United Nations, the creation of a European Union, the decolonization of all previous empires, the partition of India and Pakistan, a communist regime take hold in China, an astronaut on the moon, a civil rights movement, 3 Arab-Israeli wars, an Iranian revolution, and all as the United States and the Soviet Union remain locked in the stalemate of Cold War nuclear proliferation. The Cold War would turn hot in both Korea and Vietnam, the latter specifically being a horror to the American public and to the world. In 1989, the Berlin Wall separating East and West Berlin came down, and the Soviet Union would collapse in 1991. Whew, if the 20th century had a greatest hits album, I'd like to think that was it. Oh, did I mention the internet? Now, our current century is only in its 20th year, and yet so much has happened. Where we're headed, I don't know in these trying times of the coronavirus pandemic, but I'd like to leave you with the words that bring me the most hope when I look back on world history. And they are these. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's our preamble, and it still fills me with hope. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation on world history. If there is a particular subject or period or time that interests you, feel free to shoot an email to ask@belmorelibrary.org and just put history lectures in the subject line, and I'm happy to do a presentation on anything you may be interested in.